In a quiet corner of Lisbon, where the streets climbed steep hills and laundry fluttered like flags between old apartment buildings, there lived a boy named Tiago. He was 10 years old, small for his age, with eyes that seemed to hold more than a child's share of quiet. His hair was always a little messy, his shoes scuffed from walking, and his voice, well, he rarely used it. Not because he couldn't speak, but because words never felt like enough. They were too clumsy, too loud, too quick to misunderstand. So Tiago learned to listen instead. He lived with his grandmother, Dona Lourdes, on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been painted yellow, but now wore the soft gray of time and sea air. Their apartment smelled of cinnamon, old books, and the faint tang of damp plaster after rain. The kitchen window looked out over a narrow alley where cats napped in sunbeams and neighbors shouted greetings from their balconies. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was theirs. Tiago's parents were gone, not in the way people sometimes say gone when someone's just away for work or traveling. No, they were truly gone. His father, a construction worker with calloused hands and a laugh that filled rooms, had died in an accident when Tiago was only 4. His mother, unable to carry the weight of that loss, had drifted farther and farther away until one day she didn't come back at all. Dona Lourdes never spoke ill of her, but sometimes, when she thought Tiago was asleep, he'd hear her humming a sad fado song while washing dishes. Her shoulders hunched like she was carrying something heavy on her back. School was fine. Tiago didn't hate it, but he didn't love it either. He sat near the window in class, watching clouds move across the sky while the teacher talked about fractions or verbs. The other kids played football at recess, shouting and chasing each other, but Tiago usually stayed under the big jacaranda tree, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. He wasn't lonely exactly, he just felt different, like he was watching life through a window instead of living inside it. But everything changed the day he heard the piano. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. After school let out early because of a teacher's meeting. Tiago had walked farther than usual, past the bakery where he sometimes got day-old bread for his grandmother, past the little park with the broken swing, all the way to the edge of the neighborhood where the buildings grew taller and the streets felt less familiar. That's when he heard it, a sound so rich and deep it made his chest feel tight. It came from an open window above a shuttered bookstore. The notes weren't like the tinny music from the radio or the cheerful jingles from ice cream trucks. This was something else, slow, a little sad, but also strong, like someone telling a secret in a language made of air and wood and wire. Tiago stopped walking. He stood there, backpack dangling from one shoulder, listening until the music stopped. He didn't know what it was called. He didn't know it was Chopin. He just knew he needed to hear it again. The next day he went back. And the next, he'd stand across the street waiting, hoping to catch even a few notes. One afternoon, the door to the building was propped open with a brick. Curiosity pulled him inside. The hallway smelled of dust and floor wax. At the end of it, a door stood slightly ajar. From within came the same sound, softer now, more hesitant, like someone practicing. Tiago peeked in. The room was large but simple, with wooden floors and tall windows that let in golden afternoon light. In the center sat an old upright piano, its black paint chipped near the pedals. A woman with silver hair pulled into a bun sat on the bench, her fingers moving slowly over the keys. She wasn't playing a song Tiago recognized, just scales over and over, up and down. But even that sounded beautiful to him. She noticed him after a few minutes. Instead of shooing him away, she smiled. "You can come in," she said gently. "Just don't touch anything." Tiago stepped inside, careful not to make noise. He sat on a folding chair in the corner and watched. The woman played for another 10 minutes, then closed the piano lid with a soft click. "My name is Senora Elisa," she said. "I used to teach music here before the funding ran out. Now I just come by to keep the piano company." Tiago nodded. He didn't say anything. She studied him for a moment. "Do you like music?" He thought about it. Then he nodded again, more firmly this time. Senora Elisa smiled. "Good. Music doesn't need words." She left shortly after, but not before unlocking the piano and leaving the bench pulled out, as if inviting someone to sit. Tiago waited until her footsteps faded down the hall. Then, heart-pounding, he walked to the piano. He touched one key. A soft C note rang out clear and warm. He pressed another, then another. Soon he was pressing clusters of keys, listening to how they sounded together. Happy, sad, confused, calm. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't trying to play a song. He was just talking, in a way he never could with his voice. From that day on, Tiago came every afternoon after school. Senora Elisa would sometimes be there, sometimes not. When she was, she'd sit quietly in the corner, knitting or reading, never interrupting. When she wasn't, Tiago had the room to himself. He began to remember the melodies he'd heard, the one from the open window, the scales Senora Elisa practiced, even the tune his grandmother hummed while cooking. He'd try to find those notes on the piano, hunting for them like treasures hidden in the keys. It wasn't easy. His fingers were small and sometimes they'd slip or press the wrong key. But he didn't mind. Mistakes felt honest, and slowly something began to happen. The sounds he made started to connect. They began to tell stories, not with words but with feeling. A rainy day, a missed hug, the way sunlight looked on his grandmother's hands when she stirred soup. He didn't plan these things. They just came out, Senora Elisa noticed. One day, she left a piece of sheet music on the piano stand, a simple melody with big notes and few sharps. Tiago didn't know how to read it, but he looked at the shapes, the way the notes rose and fell on the page, and tried to guess what it might sound like. He played something close enough that Senora Elisa's eyes widened. "You've never had a lesson?" she asked. Tiago shook his head. "Then how?" He just shrugged. The music was already inside him. He just had to let it out. Weeks turned into months. Tiago's visits became part of the rhythm of the neighborhood. Shopkeepers would see him walking with his backpack, head down, and nod hello. The old man at the newsstand started saving him the comics section from the weekend paper. Dona Lourdes never asked where he went. She just made sure his shoes were tied and his jacket was zipped. She could see the change in him. He still didn't talk much, but his eyes were brighter. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd hum little tunes while setting the table. One rainy afternoon, Senora Elisa stayed late. The sky was gray and the sound of rain tapped gently on the windows. Tiago was playing, a slow, wandering piece he'd made up that morning, inspired by the smell of wet earth. When he finished, Senora Elisa was quiet for a long time. "Tiago," she said finally, "have you ever heard of the Youth Conservatory?" He shook his head. "It's a school for young musicians. They give lessons, hold concerts, even offer scholarships for children who show real talent." Tiago looked down at his hands. "I'm not talented," he mumbled, the first full sentence he'd spoken to her in months. Senora Elisa leaned forward. "Talent isn't just about playing fast or reading music perfectly. It's about making someone feel something when you play. And you make the room breathe." He didn't know what to say to that. She reached into her bag and pulled out a flyer. "Auditions are next month. You should try." Tiago stared at the paper like it might burn him. "I don't even know what to play." "You'll know," she said simply. "The music will tell you." That night, Tiago couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the rain and thinking about the conservatory. What if they laughed at him? What if he froze up and couldn't play anything at all? What if they said he wasn't good enough? But then he remembered the feeling of the keys under his fingers, the way time seemed to slow down, how the world outside disappeared. That was real. That was his. The next day, he told Senora Elisa he'd try. She didn't cheer or clap. She just nodded like she'd known all along. "Good," she said. "Now let's find you a piece." Over the next few weeks, they listened to recordings, Chopin, Debussy, even some Portuguese composers Tiago had never heard of. He didn't understand the names or the history, but he felt the music. One evening, a nocturne by Chopin came on, the same one he'd heard that first day from the open window. He sat very still as it played, tears welling in his eyes without warning. "This one," he whispered. Senora Elisa smiled. "It's difficult." "I don't care." She wrote out the notes by hand on large sheet music, spacing them far apart so he could follow the shape of the melody. He didn't learn it the way most students would, measure by measure, hand separate, metronome ticking. He learned it by heart, by ear, by feeling. He played it over and over until his fingers ached, until the phrases flowed like breath. Dona Lourdes watched from the doorway one evening, arms crossed, eyes glistening. She didn't say anything. But the next morning, she polished his only pair of shoes with olive oil until they shone like dark river stones. The day before the audition, Tiago stood in front of the mirror in his best shirt, slightly too big but clean, and practiced bowing. He felt nervous, yes, but also something else, a quiet certainty. He wasn't going to impress anyone. He wasn't going to prove anything. He was just going to play the music that lived inside him, and maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. As he walked to the conservatory the next morning, the city seemed louder than usual, buses rumbling, seagulls crying, people chatting on street corners, but inside Tiago there was calm. He carried the piano with him in his hands, in his chest, in the silence between his thoughts. He didn't know what would happen when he sat down at that grand piano in front of strangers. He didn't know they'd doubt him. He didn't know one of them would make a cruel joke about kneeling. All he knew was this: when his fingers touched the keys, the world would make sense again, even if just for a few minutes, and that was enough. The morning of the audition dawned cool and bright, the kind of Lisbon day where the sky seems scrubbed clean and the light bounces off white walls like it's happy to be there. Tiago woke before his grandmother, dressed quietly in his best trousers and the shirt she'd ironed the night before. His shoes, polished to a soft gleam, sat by the door like two quiet promises. He ate a small piece of bread with honey, his favorite, and drank a glass of milk, though his stomach felt tight, like someone had tied a knot inside it. Donna Lourdes found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands as if they might betray him. She didn't say much. She just smoothed his hair, kissed the top of his head, and handed him a small cloth bundle. Inside was a handkerchief embroidered with tiny blue flowers. Her mother's, she said. For luck, she whispered. Tiago tucked it into his pocket, feeling its weight like a secret anchor. Senora Elisa met them outside the conservatory, standing beneath a stone archway worn smooth by decades of students passing through. She wore a dark dress and a string of pearls, her silver hair pinned neatly back. When she saw Tiago, she gave him a small, steady smile. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded, though his throat felt dry. The conservatory was grand in a way that made Tiago feel small, not in a bad way, but like standing under a tall tree and realizing how old the world really was. Marble floors echoed with footsteps. Oil paintings of stern-faced musicians lined the walls. Somewhere, a violinist practiced a fast, fluttering passage that sounded like birds taking flight. They were shown to a waiting room with stiff-backed chairs and a single potted fern that looked as nervous as Tiago felt. Other children sat with parents or teachers, flipping through sheet music, stretching their fingers, humming softly to themselves. Most wore crisp clothes and carried leather cases with their names stitched in gold thread. Tiago kept his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor. One boy, older and confident, glanced at him and whispered something to his mother. Tiago didn't hear the words, but he felt the look, curious, maybe a little dismissive. He didn't mind. He wasn't here to compete. He was here to play. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, a woman in a navy blazer opened the door. "Tiago?" she called. He stood. Senora Elisa squeezed his shoulder. "Remember," she said softly, "you're not playing for them. You're playing for the music." He walked down a short hallway, his shoes clicking softly against the floor. At the end stood a heavy wooden door. It opened. Inside, the room was large but not cold. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the floor. In the center sat a grand piano, black, gleaming, so much bigger than the upright back at the community center. Tiago's breath caught. It looked like something from a dream. Behind a long table sat 3 people, 2 women and 1 man. The man sat in the middle, arms crossed, back straight, eyes sharp. He had thick eyebrows and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. Tiago recognized him from a poster in the hallway. Maestro Ribeiro, head of the piano department, former concert performer, known for his exacting standards and sharp tongue. Tiago's stomach twisted. The woman on the left smiled gently. "Hello, Tiago, please come in." He walked to the piano, his legs feeling stiff. He bowed slightly as he'd practiced, then sat on the bench. It was higher than he expected. He adjusted it quickly, heart pounding. "Do you have a piece prepared?" asked the woman on the right. Tiago nodded. He pulled the folded sheet music from his pocket. Senora Elisa's handwritten copy of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. He placed it carefully on the stand, though he knew he wouldn't really need it. He'd played this piece so many times in his head, in the dark, in the rain, that it lived in his bones. He placed his hands on the keys. They felt cool and smooth, familiar, but before he could press a single note, Maestro Ribeiro spoke. "Another street performer hoping for a miracle," he said, not loudly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. He didn't look at Tiago. He looked at the other panelists as if sharing a private joke. Tiago's fingers froze. The room went quiet. Even the distant sound of a flute from another room seemed to stop. Senora Elisa, watching from the doorway, stiffened. Dona Lourdes, who had been allowed to sit in the back, closed her eyes for a second as if praying. Tiago stared at the keys. His face burned. He wanted to stand up and run. But then he remembered the handkerchief in his pocket. He remembered the way the music felt when it poured out of him, like coming home after being lost. This wasn't about the maestro. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about the notes waiting inside him, needing to be heard. He took a slow breath and then, just as his fingers began to move, Ribeiro leaned forward with a smirk and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." A few nervous laughs followed. One of the women on the panel shot him a look but said nothing. Tiago didn't look up. He didn't flinch. He just let his hands fall where they needed to go. The first note rang out, soft, questioning, like a whisper in the dark. Then another, and another. At first, it was simple. Just the opening phrase of the nocturne, gentle and flowing. But even in those first few seconds, something shifted in the room. The laughter died. The tension softened. Even Maestro Ribeiro stopped smirking, because Tiago wasn't just playing the notes. He was telling a story. His version wasn't perfect. His left hand sometimes lagged behind the right. He missed a sharp here and there. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the feeling. The deep, aching beauty he pulled from the piano like drawing water from a well. He played like someone who had known loss but still believed in tenderness. Like someone who had been silent for so long that now, finally, he had something to say. The melody rose and fell like breath. In the quiet passages, you could hear the rustle of someone shifting in their seat, the distant hum of the city outside. But mostly there was silence, the kind that comes when people are truly listening. Maestro Ribeiro uncrossed his arms. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, chin in his hands. His eyes, once sharp and mocking, were wide now, almost startled. Tiago didn't notice. He was somewhere else, back in the community center. Rain tapping on the roof. In his grandmother's kitchen, steam rising from a pot of soup. In the quiet space between heartbeats where music lives. He reached the middle section of the piece where the chords grow richer, more urgent. His fingers moved faster now, not with showy speed but with purpose. He leaned into the keys, letting the piano sing. The room seemed to shrink around him until it was just him and the instrument, speaking the same language. When he reached the final pages, he slowed again. The music became fragile, like glass held up to the light. He lingered on the last chord, letting it fade slowly into silence. Then he lifted his hands. For a long moment, no one moved. No one clapped. No one spoke. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then one of the women on the panel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The other nodded slowly, lips parted in quiet awe. Maestro Ribeiro sat very still. Tiago looked up finally. His heart was racing, but his hands were calm. He expected criticism. He expected to be told he wasn't ready, that he needed years of training before even thinking about a place like this. Instead, Maestro Ribeiro stood. He didn't say a word. He walked slowly around the table, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He stopped in the center of the room, the exact spot where he'd made his boast, and knelt, not quickly, not dramatically, but deliberately, with his hands resting on his knees, head slightly bowed, as if in reverence. The gesture was so unexpected, so utterly out of character, that even the panelists seemed stunned. Tiago stared. Wide-eyed, Ribeiro stayed there for several seconds. Then he rose, brushed off his trousers, and walked back to his seat. He didn't look at Tiago, he didn't apologize. But something in his posture had changed, something humbled. "Thank you," the woman on the left finally said, her voice thick. That was extraordinary. Tiago nodded, unable to speak. He walked out on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Senora Elisa was waiting in the hall. She didn't hug him. She knew he didn't like that. But she placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled, her eyes shining. Dona Lourdes rushed over, pulling him into a tight embrace before he could protest. "You were beautiful," she whispered into his hair. Back outside, the city felt different. The same buses, the same seagulls, the same chatter. But everything seemed brighter, sharper, as if the world had been tuned to a new key. They didn't talk much on the walk home. Tiago kept his hands in his pockets, feeling the ghost of the piano keys under his fingertips. He replayed the moment in his head, the silence after the last note, the way the maestro had knelt, not in mockery, but in something that looked a lot like respect. That evening, a staff member who had been cleaning nearby rooms showed Senora Elisa a short video she'd recorded on her phone, just the last minute of Tiago's performance and the moment Ribeiro knelt. Senora Elisa hesitated, then shared it with a few trusted musician friends. She didn't post it online. She didn't want Tiago to become a spectacle. But word spread quietly, like a rumor passed between old friends over coffee. Within days, people began calling the conservatory asking about the boy who made Ribeiro kneel. Music teachers in other cities sent messages. A local radio station asked for an interview. A small newspaper wanted to write a feature, but Tiago didn't care about any of that. What stayed with him wasn't the fame or the surprise, it was the feeling of being heard. For the first time in his life, someone had listened not to his silence, but to what lived beneath it. At dinner that night, Dona Lourdes served his favorite, bacalhau cakes with lemon wedges. She didn't mention the audition. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way he sat a little taller, in the way he hummed softly while washing his hands. Later, as he lay in bed, Tiago pulled out the blue handkerchief and held it to his chest. Outside, the city hummed its usual night song, cars, distant laughter, the occasional bark of a dog. But in his mind there was only music, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was watching life through a window. He was inside it, playing his part. The days after the audition unfolded like pages turning in a story Tiago never expected to be part of. At first, nothing seemed to change. He still walked to school the same way, still sat under the jacaranda tree at recess, still came home to the smell of garlic and olive oil simmering in his grandmother's kitchen. But something invisible had shifted, like a door had opened somewhere deep inside him and light was finally getting through. Then the calls started. Senora Elisa fielded most of them. A radio station wanted Tiago to play live on air. A small concert hall in the city center offered him a spot in their Young Talents series. A music magazine asked for an interview. Even the conservatory, usually slow and formal, sent a letter the very next week offering him a full scholarship, tuition, books, even a small stipend for performance attire. It was more than generous. It was life-changing, but Dona Lourdes wasn't sure. She sat at the kitchen table one evening, the letter spread out before her like a map to a place she didn't recognize. "They want him to perform," she said quietly to Senora Elisa, who had come by with a pot of stew and news from the conservatory. In front of people. "Cameras maybe." Senora Elisa stirred her tea. "He doesn't have to say yes to everything, but he should be allowed to grow." "He's just a boy," Dona Lourdes replied, her voice tight. "Not a show." "No one's asking him to be a show," Senora Elisa said gently. "But music isn't meant to stay locked in a practice room. It's meant to be shared. And Tiago, he has something rare. Not just skill, soul." Dona Lourdes looked toward Tiago's room where he was practicing softly, the same Chopin nocturne, but slower now, more thoughtful. She sighed. "I just don't want them to take his quiet away." In the end, they agreed on a compromise. Tiago would accept the scholarship. He'd attend the conservatory, take lessons, learn to read music properly. But he wouldn't do interviews. No photos unless absolutely necessary, and no performances unless he felt ready, and only in places that felt safe. His first day at the conservatory was overwhelming. The building buzzed with energy, students rushing to class, cellos clattering in hallways, someone always practicing somewhere, even during lunch. Tiago wore his second-best shirt and carried a notebook Senora Elisa had given him, its cover plain and unmarked. He kept his eyes down, shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to disappear into the walls. But word had spread. Whispers followed him down the corridors. "That's him. The one who made Ribeiro kneel. He doesn't even read music." Some students stared. Others avoided him, as if his talent might be contagious or intimidating. Only one person approached him directly. It was Maestro Ribeiro himself. Tiago was sitting alone in a practice room during break, running his fingers over the keys without making a sound when the door opened. He looked up startled. Ribeiro stood there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. "You start with Professor Mina," he said, his voice quieter than Tiago remembered. "She teaches fundamentals, ear training, sight reading theory." Tiago nodded. Ribeiro paused. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "Don't lose what you have while you're learning what you don't." And with that he turned and walked away. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Professor Mina turned out to be kind, patient, with a soft voice and a habit of humming while she wrote on the chalkboard. She didn't treat Tiago like a prodigy or a curiosity. She treated him like a student, and that was exactly what he needed. At first, reading music felt like learning to walk again. The notes on the page didn't match the sounds in his head. His fingers, used to finding their own way, rebelled against the strict timing of a metronome. He'd get frustrated, sometimes slamming the piano lid shut in silent anger. But Professor Mina never scolded him. "Your ear is your gift," she'd say. "Now we're just giving it a map." Slowly, things began to click. He learned to see the shape of a melody before he played it. He discovered that sharps and flats weren't just marks on paper. They were colors, moods, directions. And when he played something new, he no longer had to hunt for the notes. He could see them, hear them, feel them, all at once. Still, the pressure grew, not from the school, not even from his teachers, but from outside. A local news segment aired a short piece about him. Just 30 seconds of the audition video, a few words from Senora Elisa, and a shot of Tiago walking into the conservatory, head down. It was respectful, but it was enough. People recognized him now. Shopkeepers called his name. Strangers asked for photos. Once a woman stopped him on the street and said, "Play something for us." He didn't know what to do. He just shook his head and walked faster. At home, Dona Lourdes started locking the apartment door during the day. "Just in case," she said. The worst moment came when a blogger published an article titled "The Tragic Piano Boy of Lisbon," full of assumptions about his parents, his lonely childhood, his miraculous rise from poverty. Tiago read it once, then crumpled the printout and threw it in the bin without a word. But Dona Lourdes cried that night quietly in the kitchen while washing dishes. "They don't know you," she told him the next morning, her voice firm. "They see a story. But you're not a story. You're my Tiago." He hugged her then, rare for him, and held on longer than usual. Maestro Ribeiro noticed the change too. He began stopping by Tiago's practice sessions, not to critique, but to listen. Sometimes he'd sit in the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes closed. Other times he'd ask a single question. "Why did you slow down there?" Or, "What were you feeling in that phrase?" Tiago slowly began to answer, not with long explanations, just simple truths. It felt like waiting. Like someone was about to say goodbye. Like the sun coming up after a long night. Ribeiro would nod, as if those answers made more sense than any technical analysis ever could. One afternoon, after weeks of silence between them, Ribeiro said, "You'll play in the winter recital." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Tiago froze. "I'm not ready." "You've been ready since the day you walked in here," Ribeiro said. "Now you just need to believe it." The recital was 3 months away. Tiago spent every spare moment practicing, not just the piece he'd chosen, a Debussy prelude this time, dreamy and fluid, but also learning to stand on stage without shaking, to bow without looking at the floor, to breathe when his chest felt tight. Senora Elisa helped him rehearse in the community center, now quiet and empty most days. "Imagine the audience isn't there," she said. "Or better yet, imagine they're all people who need to hear this music." Because they do. Dona Lourdes sewed him a new shirt, white cotton, simple cut with tiny blue stitches along the collar, matching the handkerchief. "So you remember who you're playing for," she said. The night of the recital arrived cold and clear. The conservatory's small concert hall filled quickly. Parents, teachers, a few local musicians, even a reporter from the city's arts magazine. Tiago waited backstage, heart hammering, hands tucked into his pockets to keep them warm. Then his name was called. He walked out slowly, the stage lights warm on his skin. He bowed, sat, placed his hands on the keys, and played. This time, there was no mockery, no doubt, just music, pure, honest, alive. When he finished, the applause was gentle at first, then grew into something warm and steady, like rain on a roof. He bowed again, this time looking up, and saw his grandmother in the third row, tears streaming down her face, smiling so wide it hurt to look at her. Afterward, people came up to him, not to take photos, but to say thank you. That reminded me of my mother, one woman said. I haven't heard Debussy in years, said an old man, his voice thick. You made it feel new. Maestro Ribeiro didn't say much. He just placed a hand on Tiago's shoulder and gave a single nod. But in that nod was everything, respect, pride, even a kind of quiet awe. Later, as they walked home under a sky full of stars, Donna Lourdes held his hand, something she hadn't done since he was little. You were brave, she said. I was scared, he admitted. That's what makes it brave. Back in their apartment, the city quiet around them, Tiago sat at the small keyboard Senora Elisa had gifted him, a portable one, so he could practice at home. He didn't play anything fancy, just a few chords, soft and slow, like a lullaby for the day that had passed. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He was still just a boy who didn't like crowds and preferred silence to small talk. But now he knew something important. His music wasn't just for him. It was a bridge, a gift, a way to say the things words never could, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Time passed, as it always does, in quiet steps and sudden leaps. Tiago settled into life at the conservatory like a river finding its course, sometimes smooth, sometimes rocky, but always moving forward. He learned to read music fluently, his fingers now dancing across the keys with both instinct and discipline. He studied Bach's clean lines, Beethoven's storms, and the delicate watercolors of Ravel. He even began composing short pieces of his own, fragments of feeling set to sound, like diary entries only the piano could understand. But with growth came new kinds of pressure. It wasn't loud or cruel. It didn't come from shouting or demands. It came in softer forms. Expectations wrapped in praise, opportunities dressed as obligations, and the quiet weight of being the boy who made Ribeiro kneel. People didn't say it out loud anymore, but he felt it in their eyes, in the way teachers paused when he entered a room, in the hushed conversations that stopped when he walked by, in the way even strangers seemed to hold their breath when he sat at a piano. Maestro Ribeiro, now acting as his unofficial mentor, pushed him harder than anyone, not out of harshness, but because he saw something in Tiago that frightened even him, a raw, untamed gift that could either bloom into something timeless or burn out under the wrong light. You can't rely on feeling alone. Ribeiro told him one afternoon after a lesson that had left Tiago frustrated. Feeling gets you in the door. Technique keeps you on the stage. Tiago knew he was right. But every time he tried to perfect a passage, every time he slowed down to count beats or adjust his wrist angle, he felt like he was putting his music in a cage. The notes became correct, but they lost their breath. They sounded like answers to a test, not truths from the heart. One evening, after a particularly grueling session with a difficult list etude, Tiago slammed the piano lid shut and walked out of the practice room without a word. He wandered the empty halls of the conservatory, past closed doors behind which other students practiced with metronomes ticking like clocks counting down. He ended up on the rooftop terrace where the city stretched out below him, lights flickering like stars fallen to earth, the Tagus River glinting under the moon. He sat on the cold stone ledge and pulled out the blue handkerchief, now frayed at the edges from being carried everywhere. He didn't cry. He just sat, feeling the wind on his face, wondering when music had started to feel like work instead of refuge. Donna Lourdes noticed the change. He came home quieter than usual, ate less, spent more time staring out the window. One night she made his favorite, soup, creamy potato with a hint of smoked paprika, and sat across from him at the small kitchen table. You don't have to do this if it hurts, she said gently. Tiago stirred his spoon in the bowl. It's not that it hurts. It's that I don't recognize myself in it anymore. She waited. I used to play because it felt like breathing. he said slowly. Now I play because I'm supposed to. Because people expect it. Because if I stop, they'll say I was just a fluke. Donna Lourdes reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was thin, her knuckles swollen with age, but her grip was steady. Then stop playing for them, she said. Play for the boy who first touched those keys in that dusty room. Play for the silence he carried. Play for me if you want, but don't lose yourself trying to become what they think you should be. Her words stayed with him. The next day, he went back to the community center, the old building with the chipped paint and the upright piano that had first welcomed him. Senora Elisa was there, dusting the windowsill. She didn't ask why he'd come. She just nodded and left him alone. Tiago sat at the piano and played nothing from his conservatory repertoire. No Chopin, no Debussy, no Liszt. He played a simple melody he'd made up that morning, a tune about the sound of rain on the roof, about his grandmother humming while folding laundry, about the way the light looked in the hallway when he came home from school. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. For the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again. Still, the outside world kept knocking. A prestigious summer music festival in the north invited him to perform as a featured young artist. A well-known piano brand offered to sponsor him. Free instruments, travel, even a small stipend. A documentary filmmaker asked if he'd be willing to share his story on camera. Donna Lourdes turned down the filmmaker immediately. No, she said firmly. His story is his. Not for screens, but the festival. That was harder. It was a real opportunity. Chance to play in a historic hall, to meet master teachers, to hear other young musicians from across Europe. Senora Elisa thought he should go. Even Ribeiro surprisingly encouraged it. It's not about fame, Ribeiro told him one day after class. It's about context. You need to hear other voices to understand your own. So Tiago agreed. The festival was held in a centuries-old monastery turned cultural center, nestled in green hills far from the noise of the city. The air smelled of pine and damp stone. Students from Germany, Poland, Italy, and beyond filled the courtyards, laughing in a dozen languages, practicing in sunlit cloisters. At first, Tiago felt out of place. These kids had been training since they were 5. They spoke of competitions like old battles, of teachers like generals. They carried themselves with a confidence that felt foreign to him, but then he heard them play, and something shifted. He listened to a girl from Finland play a haunting Sibelius transcription with icy precision and deep sorrow. He watched a boy from Greece tear through a Prokofiev sonata with fire in his fingers. He sat in the back of a rehearsal hall and heard a quartet from Belgium weave their instruments together like threads in a tapestry. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like part of something bigger, a long, winding river of music that had been flowing long before him and would keep flowing long after. When it was his turn to perform, he chose a piece he'd never played publicly before, his own composition, For the Hands That Waited. It was short, barely 4 minutes, but every note carried weight. He played it simply, without flourish, letting the silences speak as loudly as the sounds. Afterward, no one clapped right away. They just sat still as if waking from a dream. Then the applause came, not loud, but deep, the kind that rises from the chest, not the hands. Later that night, several students found him sitting alone in the garden. They didn't ask for autographs or selfies. They just sat with him, sharing bread and stories. One asked how he'd learned to make the piano sound like a person talking. Another asked if he'd ever felt like quitting. Tiago smiled faintly. Every week they laughed. Not at him. With him. For the first time, he didn't feel like a symbol or a miracle. He felt like a musician, flawed, searching, human. But the real test came when he returned to Lisbon. The conservatory wanted him to prepare for a national youth competition, a high-profile event with judges from major music schools across Europe. Winning could mean invitations to international festivals, master classes with world-renowned pianists, maybe even a recording contract. Ribeiro was adamant. "This is your moment," he said. "Don't waste it," Tiago tried. He practiced for hours, drilling passages until his fingers ached. He recorded himself, listened back, made adjustments. But the more he polished the piece, a technically dazzling Rachmaninoff prelude, the more it felt hollow. One afternoon, during a rehearsal with Ribeiro watching, he stopped mid-phrase. "I can't do this," he said quietly. Ribeiro frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this isn't me. I'm playing what you want to hear, what the judges expect." "But it's not true." Ribeiro was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Truth doesn't win competitions." "Maybe not," Tiago replied. "But it's the only thing worth playing." Ribeiro looked at him, not with anger but with something like sadness. "The world doesn't reward truth, boy. It rewards perfection." "Then maybe I don't want the world's reward," Tiago said. He withdrew from the competition the next day. There was disappointment, of course. Whispers that he'd wasted his chance. A few teachers shook their heads. But Dona Lourdes hugged him tightly. Senor Elisa brought him a slice of almond cake and said, "You chose your soul over a trophy. That's real courage. And Maestro Ribeiro?" He didn't speak to Tiago for 2 weeks. Then, one rainy afternoon, he appeared at the community center. Tiago was playing softly, a simple folk tune he'd heard his grandmother sing years ago. Ribeiro stood in the doorway, coat dripping, watching. When Tiago finished, Ribeiro walked in and sat on the folding chair Senora Elisa always used. "You'll never be a star," he said bluntly. Tiago nodded. "I know. But you might be something rarer," Ribeiro continued. "A musician who stays honest." "That's harder. And more important." He didn't say more. He just sat there for a while listening as Tiago played again, this time a new piece. Rough around the edges, full of pauses and questions. And for the first time, Ribeiro didn't correct a single note. Back at home that night, Tiago sat at his small keyboard and played for no one but himself. The city hummed outside. His grandmother dozed in her armchair, a book open on her lap. The blue handkerchief lay on the piano, a quiet reminder. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't need to be. All he knew was this: he would keep playing, not for fame, not for approval, but because the music still lived inside him, waiting to be set free. And that was enough. 7 years had passed since the day a quiet boy walked into an audition room and made a hardened maestro kneel. Lisbon hadn't changed much. The same trams clattered up the hills, the same seagulls circled over the river, the same smell of coffee and fresh bread drifted from corner cafes. But Tiago had, not in a flashy way, not in the way people expected when they heard his story. He hadn't become a globe-trotting concert star, hadn't graced magazine covers or played in grand halls with crystal chandeliers. Instead, he'd grown into something quieter, deeper, like a tree that doesn't reach for the sky but spreads its roots wide, offering shade to those who need it. Now 17, Tiago still lived with his grandmother, though the apartment felt different, lighter somehow. Dona Lourdes moved slower these days, her hands more fragile, but her eyes still sparkled when she heard him practice. She never asked about fame or missed opportunities. She only asked, "Did you play something true today?" And most days he had. He'd finished his studies at the conservatory not with fanfare but with quiet pride. He'd turned down offers to tour, to record, to join elite young artist programs, not out of fear but because none of them felt right. Instead, he'd started teaching piano at the very community center where it had all begun. The old upright piano had been replaced with a donated baby grand, still modest but warm and well-loved. And every afternoon, children from the neighborhood would come, some dragging reluctant parents behind them, others arriving alone with scuffed shoes and curious eyes. Tiago didn't teach scales first. He didn't hand out sheet music on day one. He asked them what sound made them happy. Was it rain, thunder, a lullaby their abuela used to sing? Then he'd help them find that sound on the keys. He taught them that music wasn't about being perfect, it was about being honest. One girl, Lena, had lost her brother the year before. She never spoke about it. But when she played, her hands told the story, slow, heavy chords that trembled like tears. Tiago didn't correct her rhythm. He just sat beside her and played a soft harmony underneath, like holding her hand without touching. Another boy, Mateus, couldn't sit still for more than 30 seconds. So Tiago taught him to play with his whole body, stomping rhythms, clapping, even dancing between phrases. Music isn't just in your fingers, he'd say. It's in your feet, your breath, your heartbeat. Parents would linger in the doorway, surprised. "He never sits still at school," one mother whispered. But here, "He's calm," Tiago just smiled. "He's not calm. He's free." Word spread. More children came, some from broken homes, some from crowded apartments with no room for noise, some just searching for a place where they belonged. Tiago never turned anyone away. If a family couldn't pay, he traded lessons for baked goods for help fixing the center's leaky faucet for stories. He believed music should never be locked behind money. And through it all, he kept playing himself, not for crowds, but for moments. He'd play early in the morning when the city was still asleep, or late at night when the streetlights cast long shadows through the windows. Sometimes he'd compose, short pieces with names like Tuesday After Rain or Grandmother's Hands. He never published them. He didn't need to. They existed, and that was enough. Then came the invitation. It arrived in a plain envelope, hand-delivered by a former conservatory staff member. Inside was a simple note from the current director of the youth conservatory. We're hosting a small recital to honor the legacy of community music in Lisbon. We'd be honored if you'd play. Just you, your piano, and whoever shows up. No pressure. No expectations. Just a room, a piano, and an open door. Tiago almost said no. He hadn't performed publicly in years, but then he thought of the boy he'd been, the one who'd played not for applause but because the music demanded to be heard. And he said yes. The recital was set for a Saturday evening in the same community center where he'd first touched a piano. Volunteers cleaned the space, hung string lights, arranged folding chairs. Senora Elisa, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, helped organize the program. Dona Lourdes insisted on baking dozens of pastéis de nata, her hands trembling slightly but her spirit unshaken. News of the event spread quietly, not through social media or press releases but through word of mouth. Neighbors told neighbors. Parents told teachers. Old conservatory students reached out to former classmates. No one knew exactly what to expect, but they came anyway, drawn by memory, by curiosity, by the quiet legend of the boy who'd once made a maestro kneel. On the night of the recital, the room filled long before showtime. Not with critics or industry people, but with faces Tiago knew. The baker who'd given him day-old bread as a child. The newsstand owner who'd saved him comics. Lena's mother, Mateus's older sister. Even a few of his former classmates from school. And in the very back row, leaning on a cane, sat Maestro Ribeiro, older, thinner, his hair now fully white, but his eyes as intense as ever. Tiago stood backstage, just a curtain and a few potted plants separating him from the audience. His hands were steady. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. He walked out to soft applause, not thunderous but warm, like coming home. He bowed, sat, and placed his hands on the keys. He began with Bach, a simple prelude, clean and clear like morning light. Then Debussy, dreamy and fluid like water over stones. Then Chopin, the same nocturne from his audition, but played now with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through both sorrow and joy. And then he played his own piece, For the Hands That Waited. It was gentle, unfolding slowly like a letter finally opened after years in a drawer. There were no grand flourishes, no showy runs, just truth, note by note, breath by breath. He played for his father, whose hands had built things that still stood in the city. For his mother, whose absence had shaped him in ways he was still learning to understand. For his grandmother, whose hands had held him when words failed. For Senora Elisa, who'd left the piano unlocked. For every child who'd ever felt too quiet, too broken, too much or not enough. When the last note faded into silence, no one moved. No one clapped right away. They just sat, many with tears on their cheeks, as if they'd been given something precious and rare. Then slowly the room rose, not all at once, but in waves. Not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Tiago bowed again, this time looking up. He saw his grandmother wiping her eyes, smiling through tears. He saw Senora Elisa nodding, her hands clasped like in prayer. And he saw Maestro Ribeiro standing in the back, not clapping, but watching him with an expression Tiago had never seen before. Peace. Afterward, there was no rush for autographs or photos. People lingered, talking softly, eating pastries, sharing memories. A little girl tugged on Tiago's sleeve and asked, "Will you teach me to play like that?" He knelt to her level. "I'll teach you to play like you," he said. "That's even better." Later that night, as he helped clean up, Ribeiro approached him. They stood by the open window, the city lights twinkling below. "You could have had it all," Ribeiro said quietly. "The stages, the tours, the fame." Tiago looked at his hands, calloused now, strong but still gentle. "I have what matters," he said. Ribeiro was silent for a long moment. Then he placed a hand on Tiago's shoulder. "You were right," he admitted. "Perfection is empty without truth." They didn't say more. They didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic changed. Tiago returned to his teaching. The children kept coming. Donna Lourdes kept baking. Life went on, quiet and full. But something had shifted. Not in the world, but in the way people saw music. Parents stopped asking if their child would be the next Tiago. Instead, they asked, does he enjoy it? Teachers began letting students compose their own pieces, even if they were messy. The conservatory started a new outreach program, sending students to teach in underserved neighborhoods, inspired, quietly, by the path one boy had chosen. Tiago never sought recognition for any of it. He didn't need to. His legacy wasn't in recordings or headlines. It was in the way a shy boy now raised his hand in class because he'd found his voice at the piano. It was in the way a grieving mother sat in the back of the community center, listening to her daughter play and finally felt hope again. Years later, when asked what success meant to him, Tiago would simply say, "When someone hears my music and feels less alone." And that was the whole story. Not of a prodigy, not of a miracle, but of a boy who chose to stay true and in doing so, gave others permission to do the same. The piano still sits in the community center. The keys are worn in places. The bench creaks a little. But every afternoon, music rises from that room, imperfect, alive and full of heart, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of a promise kept. Not to be famous, not to be perfect, but to be real. That was always enough.